Hello, everyone. Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's October 22nd, 2021 program. Today's program is Responding to Fires in the Western Cascades. This is the 7th program for our 2021-22 programming year. My name's Kitty Piercy, and I'm the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofueugene.org. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook. We also have a podcast, which is available on Podbean, and the programs are broadcast on public radio station KLCC 89.7 on Monday nights at 7. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors, Kaiser Permanente, University of Oregon, Peace Health and Lane Community College, as well as generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. In today's program, we welcome speakers Amanda Astor, Associated Oregon Loggers Forest Policy Manager, and John Bailey, PhD, Oregon State University Forestry Ecosystems Department. Biographical information on our speakers is available on our website, cityclubofueugene.org. I would like to thank John Belcher for coordinating today's program. So the program is Responding to Fires in the Western Cascades. 2020 was yet another incredible year for wildfires in Western Oregon, with over 1 million acres burned, at least 11 deaths, and the loss of most of the towns of Detroit, Blue River, and Vida. The fires of 2021 are still burning over hundreds of thousands of acres. What has caused this new normal of hazardous conditions, including spates of poor air quality all the way to Central Park in New York? Is it the overzealous forest fire suppression policies, cessation of historic prescribed burns by Native Americans, people moving into the wildland-urban interface, modern forest management practices, climate change, or all of the above? Most importantly, what can you and I do to make our forests more resilient? In this program, we will hear the perspectives of John Bailey, OSU professor and expert on fuels manipulations and wildlife fire science, and Amanda Astor, forest policy manager for Associated Oregon Loggers. Join us to learn more about this hot topic in just a few minutes here. Our program today includes a question and answer period with City Club members via Zoom.
Thank you, Kitty, for introducing both our subject and our speakers. We're very pleased to have both Dr. John Bailey and Ms. Amanda Astor here today, and I will turn it over to John to start the program. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, and I have to tell you, it's an honor to address the City Club and to be on KLCC. That's been on my bucket list since I first became a listener back in the 1980s, and I would tell you how old I was at that time, but I know this is a sharp audience that would then be able to calculate my current age. So I'm a professor at Oregon State University and really been looking at these fire issues for a long time, since the time I was actually an undergraduate student at Virginia Tech and a firefighter. And over the span of that career, we've really gained a lot of information about particularly fire history and fire ecology. And so that's where I'm going to start today, is just kind of reviewing that background really briefly, because we want to get to the kind of the current situation we're in. But it's an important context to remember. And to do that, I'm going to show a few pictures and describe them for the listening audience. The first being a Douglas fir dominated forest, as is most of the Western Oregon forest. But in this case, a picture that has some ponderosa pine in it, so indicating it's a warmer, drier site. And so we'll call it a dry pine site that historically, prehistorically, was a pine dominated instead of Douglas fir dominated. And we go into these kinds of areas, and following the line of research looking at fire history and fire ecology, and we find dead wood that's in there, and we can cut into that dead wood and identify the years and amount of fire that was in these forests going back many hundreds of years, centuries. So often we can go even before Euro-American settlement. And so when we do that, we can piece together based on multiple fire scars across a hillside in a stand like this, and identify all of the fires occurring, in this case, multiple instances of fires starting in 1717, the year 1717, going all the way up to the Euro-American settlement of the area, 1895. And those that can see it or see a list of a good 20 fires or so that happened at sporadic intervals across those centuries and those decades. And mathematically, what it converts to is, on average, one fire every decade, a little bit less, 8.9 year mean fire return interval into these kinds of stands. The point being, there was a lot of fire burning in these areas. When you walk through the forest and see ponderosa pine in the mix of conifers, it's an indicator there was a lot of fire in there. Even better indicator is when you walk through stands that have oak, Oregon white oak, where some oak is still alive, or in a lot of cases, they're Douglas fir dominated forests that have dead oak in them, standing or down on the ground. And this is a picture of dead oak logs laying on the ground, in addition to some standing. And when we piece together that fire history, we see a very similar pattern with fires going back into the early 1700s up through the 1800s, with a mean fire return interval of about 5 years. And that we know reflects a lot of indigenous burning practices as well in these landscapes. But with Euro-American settlement, we turned off the faucet with that much fire in the landscape. The Douglas fir prospered from that, and they've become Douglas fir dominated forests now, and to the detriment of Oregon white oak or ponderosa pine. The real Douglas fir sites, dry Douglas fir sites, we also can construct that. It's not as much fire in there, ranging from the early 1700s to the late 1800s. But a good dozen fires or so in that period. If you do the math, that's a mean fire return interval of every 15 years. So think about that, every 15 years. So during a 45-year career in an area, on average would be three fires that burn through that area. And even areas with western hemlock in it, that at one time in my career I thought was an indicator of no fire. When we really go in and look for evidence of fire, we see multiple fires, even where we have western hemlock, but maybe only 1 or 2 fires per century in those areas. So I'm going to stop sharing and looking at pictures, and just emphasize that point that there was a lot of fire in the landscape. We largely turned that spigot off and changed our land management mindset to one of excluding fire from the landscape, actively suppressing fire, which then excludes it from other parts of the landscape. And that was part of our mission, both on private lands and on public lands. And we did that with the idea that we were saving, protecting, preserving the forest. But the key is that fire is a creative and regenerative force, in addition to being a destructive force. And so this history and prehistory of fire that we had created and maintained a forest condition that was out there. We interrupted that. We've now accumulated fuels and built forested structures that aren't nearly as resistant and resilient to fire. And so when we're getting fire out there now, it's not a low intensity or even a mixed intensity kind of fire that leaves surviving individuals behind and moving forward into the future. But it can also often be these stand replacing events. So that dynamic of the fire has changed. And so that leads us to our current condition, and that the whole question about our fire season getting worse, and what's going on out there. And I typically address that as three things that are coming together to drive this. First off, climate is becoming warmer, and our fire seasons are getting longer. So we have to be ready earlier in the year and deploying our resources. The fuels are drier early. We're reaching real depths of dry fuels and hot conditions that are ideal for high severity fire. They're persisting further into the year, and so that creates a situation for us. And it's not that we don't have a lot of data yet that storms are getting worse or winds are getting higher or that kind of stuff, but just the fire season being longer and the period of time where things are hotter and drier. That just changes the probabilities, and those probabilities catch up with us to create things like last year's Labor Day fires, this year's bootleg fire. So part of the signal is definitely the fire season and climate change. A big part of the signal is just that fuel accumulation. We've interrupted the flow of fire and that natural disturbance agent in the forest, and our basic land management practices over time have driven the accumulation of fuel on the landscape, particularly on federal lands. Pick on federal lands where here in the state of Oregon, that's half more federal ownership. About 90% of each year's growth. The trees are growing every month, every week, every year. The fuels are accumulating, and on federal lands, about 90% of that just accumulates both as living and dead material. And about a third of it is dead. So that all is fuel. Yes, it's wood, it's habitat, it's stream protection, it's scenery, it's recreational opportunities, but it's also fuel. And so that fuel accumulation has matched up with a longer fire season. And then the third leg is we just have more humans out there, both to ignite these and our infrastructure to ignite the fires, but also to be impacted by the fires. So those are the three forces that have come together that gives us this perception that things are now worse. Specifically for the Holiday Farm fire, Beachy Creek, and all that kind of stuff, I think at this point I'll hand it off to Amanda to kind of talk about what those fires did and how lands were impacted by it.
Yeah, thanks, John. I completely agree. Climate change and local weather patterns have absolutely contributed to longer fire seasons, extreme drought conditions, dry vegetation, low fuel moistures, hot weather, low relative humidity, on and on and on, right? And so when it comes to the Holiday Farm fire, Archie Creek, Lion's Head, the Labor Day fires of 2020, we had all of that happening, but we also had a historic easterly wind event. These are known events that have happened, but this one was in particularly extreme. So the winds knocked down trees, branches, and unfortunately power lines. The blazes quickly spread across our landscapes into our communities, and that caused hazardous fuels to ignite and firefighting conditions to get extreme quickly. We were really in triage mode with Associated Oregon loggers. Our contractors are firefighters, and so are many foresters out there responding quickly. But everybody was in triage mode. Our firefighting staff was stretched thin across the United States, across the West especially. And with fires that were going at extreme speeds due to that wind event, direct attack couldn't be utilized. So resources were needed to build contingency lines for backburning, to hold the fire before it could enter additional communities, for visibility. But thankfully, we were able to get things under control, mostly because the winds changed. So now where are we at? Well, there's some interesting research that goes to show that we really are not going to be having many of these easterly wind events moving forward. That's what modeling shows, at least. Some research out of University of Washington's Department of Atmospheric Science shows that as wind warms and as the climate warms, the easterly wind events might become less frequent. This is because the wind events are caused by cold, high pressure systems that come down from Canada and warm, low pressure systems that come up from California. Where those mix, that is where we got these big wind events. With the temperatures rising, those cold, high pressure systems are going to be less likely to occur. I'm not a meteorologist. I am not a climate scientist. This is just what I have been told and the research that I have seen and reviewed. So that is positive. However, I do want to put a caveat in there. With warming does come additional drying, additional evaporation, and what we call evapotranspiration, declining snowpacks. And so it's really unclear what the future has in store for us. It may not be likely that we have these easterly wind events as often that cause events like we had during the Labor Day fires of 2020, but it's unclear. So the best thing that we can do is to try to prepare for them, to do all that we can to create forest resiliency across our landscape. And so that's really, what we're excited to talk to you about. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to John.
So what is going to be the role of forestry and active forest management? As we look at wildfire behavior and this emerging problem, we don't have any control, over the weather. We have to be aware of what's going on and track it. And another thing that really regulates wildfire behavior is topography, particularly steep slopes, but that's also kind of a given for our various forest owners to deal with. Now, the only part of the equation that we can manipulate, and particularly with forest management, is the fuels side of the triangle. And so that's going to be both at the time when we're doing harvesting of various types and how we prepare a site, how we manage stand density over time, and how stands develop. So that's the implementing thinning or other stand management kinds of operations, and also prescribed fire, using fire itself as the tool it once was for keeping the level of fuels down on the landscape. Prescribed fire is particularly good at eliminating fine surface fuels that are the vector, the carrier for much of our the wildfire behavior and surface fire behavior. Even when it's a spectacular crown fire under high wind events, it's still a very important component is all of the material that is down on the surface that is burning in the process. So that's the one side of this that we're going to be able to manage. And one point to make now is that, the idea of, not doing something in the forest, more of this reserve mindset or preservation mindset is part of what's gotten us into this issue. The idea of not manipulating the vegetation, including not letting fire proceed into these forests. That can work on small spatial and temporal scales that we can preserve. We can set aside an area and say, okay, we're not going to do anything here. But in a dynamic world, that only works on the shortest temporal scales and the smallest spatial scales, because we live in a dynamic world. And we've seen plenty of events like the ones we've already talked about that burned well through lines that we drew on maps in order to set aside areas. So there is no solution where we can just say, we just won't have wildfire in this area. That's not going to be a choice. Our choice is going to be to actively manage the landscape. Now, there are multiple landowners that make up our landscapes. I've already talked about federal landowners and how we've backed off on the proactive management on those landscapes. Small woodland owners have a role to play in this as well, in terms of viewing their forests as the wonderful thing it is and all the things that it represents, but also remembering that it's fuels, and managing those surface fuels as well as the ladder fuels that connect the surface fire behavior to the grounds, and even managing the amount of aerial fuel up there. So it comes back to that message of building in resilience in our forest, and keeping the total amount of fuel and the relationship of those fuels to each other down. And that's part of even the national cohesive strategy, where we've looked at having resilient landscapes, as well as treating the urban interface where the wildlands come into our communities, and how we protect structures, and having fire safe communities in a resilient landscape, and then overall making for the safest and most effective responses when we do want to suppress. I'll let Amanda talk about what private landowners are thinking about, and industrial landowners.
Yeah, thanks, John. Private landowners and industrial landowners definitely are doing their part to maintain not just their forests as healthy forests, but maintain that access into the forest. I think one of the things that we see when these big fires take off is that private lands are often, and the roads that get to private lands or go through federal lands to get to private lands are often utilized as fire breaks. Those plantations can be used as safety zones. You have more stability and uniformity, and that's because it's a plantation. It can be more easy to understand how a fire may move through those landscapes because you have that uniformity. And I think that the other thing that's important to note is that we really are all in this together. As John said, this is not a one landowner problem. It really is everybody coming together, uniting in the fight to address these issues. And I really want to make clear that in 2019, the Governor's Council on Wildfire Response came out with recommendations to what we need to do in the state to achieve our forest resiliency goals and to achieve our response goals, and not to mention our adaptive community goals, so to fire as well. So those are three things that we all need to be doing. And the people that were on the Governor's Council and on the subcommittees were people from all different land ownerships. You had people from academia, people from federal land management, industrial land management, again, coming together to say, okay, how are we going to deal with this? And what is so great is that out of that bill and out of that council and these recommendations, this past legislative session this long legislative session in 2021, we actually developed bipartisanly a bill called Senate Bill 762. Now, this is a wildfire omnibus bill. It funds a lot of things, but we have to remember that more than anything, this is to show proof of concept and develop a framework. It's really important to note that, yes, there's a lot of things that are funded. It came with a large price tag, $220 million. But again, that's a little bit of money for a lot of different things. And we're going to need a lot more to be able to achieve our goals. The Governor's Council on Wildfire Response found that 5.6 million acres need to be treated in the state over the next 20 years. And as we've mentioned before, about 65% of that, if not more, is actually on federal lands. And so again, it's an all hands on deck. Thankfully, a handful of years ago, the state signed a shared stewardship agreement with the U.S. Forest Service and basically said, we are going to be good neighbors. We are going to be good stewards of the land. We're going to share in that responsibility. And so one of the things that the Senate Bill 762 did is that it funded at the tune of about $20 million a program for forest resiliency to develop forest resilient landscapes. And it also requires the Oregon Department of Forestry to develop a 20-year strategic plan to achieve that 5.6 million acres that is in need, desperate need of treatment, to address that high fuel loading that is just constantly being added to, as Mr. Bailey mentioned. 90% of growth every year on federal lands is just getting added to and accumulating every year in dead trees and in new growth. And so we need to address that, right? And one of the ways that we can do that is through harvesting, is through mechanical treatments of the lands in combination with, when needed, prescribed fire. But the great thing is that whenever we manipulate fuels, whether that's through non-commercial treatments, going into roads, creating good fuel breaks, or we're doing prescribed fire, piling and burning, or doing broadcast burning, or we're treating the landscape in any way, because fuel is not only in the fire triangle, but the fire behavior triangle, we will always achieve fire behavior changes when we manipulate those fuels. And as Mr. Bailey likes to say, it's physics, but it's also chemistry. It's both of them together. And so I really just want to make mention of that. And there's a ton of research out there. OSU has done some recent research to show that thinning alone can result in observable changes in fire behavior. When combined with prescribed fire, that's when we really hit the money. But it's tough sometimes with smoke management rules and not having good burn windows and adequate conditions to safely burn. At the very least, we can thin out our forests. We can do patch cuts and clear cuts in some locations, and really make a difference to the fuel load across the landscape. So, like I said, I think it's really important that we all came together, developed these recommendations a few years ago, and we're actually making actionable changes in the state. And it's not just for resilient landscapes. It's also transmission system plans, statewide mapping of wildfire risk, new regulations for defensible space, land use, building codes. All sorts of things are being developed right now and worked on. Lots of folks that are from OSU and are coworkers of Mr. Bailey, and I'm engaged, and lots of other people are engaged. So with that, I will turn it back over to John to see what else you have to say about kind of the current state of affairs here in Oregon.
Yeah, actually, I think we'll be able to segue right over to questions, but we're going to take a little break before then.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's time for Q&A, and let's start with David Stone. What's your question, sir? And who are you asking it of?
Yeah, thank you. My name's Dave Stone. I'm past conservation chair for Lane County Audubon. My question is for Dr. Bailey. You described the impact of climate change on our work to make forests more resilient. The efforts to make our forests more resilient, we also need to address climate change in addition to managing the forest. Current industrial forest practices contribute much to climate change, from removal of trees that capture and hold carbon, to transportation of logs to the mills, to the energy used to mill the logs and transport the products to market. How can logging be done in a way that significantly reduces its impact on climate change?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because forestry is really uniquely positioned as, you know, a consequence or victim of climate change, at least from the perspective of the huge wildfires we have, but also the potential to mitigate it, since our factory, the tree, does remove CO2 from the atmosphere. and stores it in the long term. And so it's something I try to acknowledge with groups when I talk to them, and with my own students as I train the next wave of professionals, that it's a wonderful position to be in, because we actually can mitigate the influence of climate change over the long term. Of course, that's a big tall order for us. The other thing that's unique about forestry and wildfire as the disturbance agent that we're concerned about is, unlike hurricanes or tornadoes, where we can just kind of buckle down and take the brunt of the storm. With wildfire storms, we actually can mitigate the ultimate intensity of the disturbance as well through fuels management, as we were talking about during the presentation. So, but what we have to look at and what we have to acknowledge is that, yes, on an individual tree basis, when we cut the tree, we have stopped that factory, that solar powered CO2 consuming factory has reached its end, and we maybe used fossil fuel for that, or at least a heavily breathing individual with a manual saw, but we stopped the CO2 factory. We emitted some CO2 in that process, and depending on how far we transported it and how it was milled, that also emitted CO2. So there's a CO2 debt associated with cutting that tree. So all things being equal, we would say, we're actually making the climate worse. But you have to remember that a sizable percentage, and we're working with things like mass timber construction and substituting for concrete and steel and asphalt and plastics and aluminum and all that kind of stuff, which have a much bigger carbon footprint than transporting wood. Working with those things to make a high percentage, like more than half of the harvested tree gets put in a long-term carbon storage pool. That's really different than alternatives. So that's the first message to remember, is that it's not, unlike wildfire, it's not all being put right back into the atmosphere, either immediately or the fact that it becomes dead standing wood to decay out on the hillsides. And then the other is the idea of, okay, if we don't harvest this tree, then yes, we save that tree, but in a global marketplace, that just means somebody else is going somewhere else to meet that demand for wood, building material, fuels, or paper, cardboard box, shipping box, Amazon boxes. Whatever, it is a global marketplace that is using this fiber one way or another. And we can influence and tweak that, but definitely what we don't want them to do is substitute aluminum, steel, concrete, cinder block, all those kinds of things, at least for the huge markets that we have, plastic wrapping instead of paper wrapping and all that kind of stuff. So in that sense, we want, from a carbon perspective, and a climate change perspective, we want to actually encourage sustainably harvesting trees and substituting for those things that are killing us and killing the planet as much and as often as we possibly can. Because the only way to really save trees and not harvest trees is to not consume the materials. And that's a tall order, not only because human population is increasing, but average standard of livings are increasing. So we are consuming more and more. And so some of the key is going to be how are we going to grow and grow sustainably as a population? And forestry and sustainable forest management and managing for the maximum amount of carbon that we can sequester on hillsides and maintain on hillsides, as well as put into long-term pools, that's going to be important. And that's how we're going to impact climate in the long term. Forestry, trees are going to be part of that solution.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'll just add too that in addition, trees don't live forever, right? Their growth tapers off somewhere on the west side in Oregon around 70 or 80 years. And so you have less vigorous growth at that time. So you're capturing and you're storing less carbon during photosynthesis. And I think it's important to note that when we have wildfires, they continue to jeopardize forest carbon permanence. So if all we focus on is storing carbon in our trees, then we're not really utilizing the forest to its greatest potential when it comes to storing carbon and to sequestering carbon. And so when we have fires, we're increasing that biogenic carbon emission. And so to me, at least as a forester, above all, I think that climate smart forestry operations must really focus on creating landscapes that are resilient to fire and that reduce that amount of emission from fire whenever possible. And then we store that carbon in durable wood products like Mr. Bailey was talking about. And I'm not just saying that because that's the topic of today's talk, but I really truly believe it as a forester as well.
Thank you both.
And shortening
Go ahead.
transportation distances, having better trucks, better milling technology, using wood waste to power the mill operations like at Seneca. Those are all fine-tuned adjustments that are just wonderful.
Okay, thanks again. Mr. Michaels.
I'm Norm Michaels. I'm a forester, small woodland owner, and member of both Society of American Foresters and Association Consulting Foresters. So probably my first question to both of our folks, Amanda Astor and John Bailey, what can a small woodland owner in Western Oregon do to make her forest more fire resilient?
I'll start with that, Amanda. Fire resilient is easier than broader climate resilience. So thank you for that, Norm. Fire resilient is just going to be paying attention to the fuel. Like we talked about with fuel, weather, and topography, regulating fire intensity. You're going to have whatever topography you have and whatever weather is coming down the pipeline, but you can manipulate the fuel. And so my recommendations would be at the time of harvest, at whatever scale, the large scale clear cuts, small patch cuts, individual tree removal, you just pay attention to what that fuel level is, particularly the fine surface fuels down on the ground. And you can handle that mechanically. There are chemicals, that you can use for shrub regrowth and all that kind of stuff. My tool of choice is prescribed burning safely, certified prescribed burning and that kind of thing to manage the amount of fine surface fuels within your forest. Because particularly when your trees are young, a low intensity fire then can even be a high intensity on a seedling or sapling. And so you're going to have a time period when your trees are young that they're going to be very sensitive. Once they're several inches in diameter and the crowns grow and they're up off of the ground, then you'll start having some individual tree resistance and overall stand resilience to future fires.
Yeah, and I'd add too to that. I'm just going to do a little plug here that one of the things that we got included in that big fire omnibus package, the Senate Bill 762, was a $5 million grant program for small woodlands to try to achieve forest resiliency on your landscapes. So that hopefully is going to be helpful coming down the pike here, as well as things like Western State Fire Managers grants. So there's other financial tools that can help achieve that work that can be costly if what you have on your specific forest is not merchantable timber, and what you need to do is remove ladder fuels or remove non-commercial material to make your forest more resilient. There's options out there too to apply for some of that money. The $5 million grant program is not up and running yet, but Oregon Department of Forestry will be utilizing the Committee for Family Forest Lands, which is advisory to the Board of Forestry, as a sounding board to create that grant criteria. So be on the lookout for that as well.
And then Norm, you want to talk about climate resilience too?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, bigger bigger issue there. And I'd say there, you work with your Oregon Department of Forestry sustainability manager, stewardship. That's the word, stewardship forester, and your local extension agent. Both, they're going to have resources to help you think about what species and what kind of spacing that you might want to plant back, or pay attention to the natural regeneration. You might want to introduce some new genetics into that as we anticipate seed zones moving a little bit because of the general warming and drought conditions that we have. So anyway, there are a ton of resources. We won't get into them today, but think about the species mix. Think about the spacing, the actual planting sites. If we're going to have more common drought conditions, then that uniform spacing and everything might not be the most efficient way to go. As you look at regenerating an idea, you might look for more ideal planting sites and how to get your stand reestablished.
Taking a look at the question queue, it looks like there's a chance for me to jump in here, if I may. It's pretty obvious that the federal agencies and the private timber industries have different objectives in how they manage their forests. And as a result, you're working with different rotation ages. The industry rotation age is much shorter than the federal age, which may be theoretically permanently. So is there a difference in management strategies between private industry and federal to provide that forest resiliency? As part of that question is, Amanda talked about thinning and prescribed burning both. Can you just manage at least the federal forest using prescribed burning alone and not having to go to thinning?
I can take that to begin with. That's a great question. I think that it's a very reasonable question to have as well. And from my experience working on federal lands and with our federal agencies, especially in Southwest Oregon, where you have very dry forest types, that comes up a lot. Can we just use fire as a tool? Well, first off, I'm going to say that we've gotten into a state on the forested landscape of much higher fuel loads than would be advisable, right? So in most cases, the forest is not in a state in which it will safely accept that fire and achieve our results that we'd like to see with our prescribed fire plans. And so in many cases, we need to do some mechanical treatment beforehand. That could be non-commercial treatments where we're just removing bladder fuels or we're removing surface fuels. We might trim up some branches, things like that, or we might remove small trees that are not merchantable at this time and utilize that in a lop and scatter or a pile or jackpot type of burning as well to get rid of that fuel on the landscape. If we can, and there is merchantable material there, that's actually a benefit because we can remove that merchantable material, collect some funding that can then go and pay for that prescribed fire. It may also be able to pay for maintaining roads. And roads are super important when it comes to proper ingress and egress for firefighters and emergency vehicles and personnel during a fire. A lot of times what happens, especially on federal lands, especially when we're in the wilderness where there are no roads or in roadless areas where we don't have good road access, that's where we see fires unfortunately get large fairly quickly because we can't size them up. We don't have good access. It is very dangerous to get to those areas on foot. It may take a really long time. It might take a smoke jumper that's really expensive. Not that we wouldn't do that. Of course, we're going to do what we need to do to fight a fire. But again, when it comes to just using fire, it can be done in some instances. But in most instances on federal land, we really need to manipulate those fuels so that the fuel bed will accept the fire and achieve our end results. Otherwise, we might have more severity than we'd like to see, so more fuel consumed. And we might even end up with more intensity, so higher flame lengths and more things burned than we'd like to see during the incident or during the prescription.
Yeah, and Amanda's spot on. We've got this backlog to deal with, and that kind of threshold between what is just going to cost us money versus what can yield money that can be then used in a stewardship sense to put roads in the proper location, enhance wildlife habitat, restore this or that, all of those kinds of things. Once that kind of second wave of entries are done and we have a more resilient landscape, that's a very interesting question. If thereafter just repeat its prescribed fire would maintain the kind of conditions that we want. Within forestry circles, we talk about that kind of uneven aged or multi-age management and how we would enter with very selective harvesting and followed by burning. Maybe we could do it with just burning, but of course that's not meeting the wood society, the wood needs of society. And so trees would be harvested elsewhere, and so we'll have that balancing act over the long term. But part of the root of your question was also that kind of early seral condition forage material down on the ground for ungulate species, for pollinators and those kinds of things. Those are in some parts of our landscape in Oregon. They're becoming very rare, because of harvesting practices and landowner patterns and all. So it is definitely something to be aware of how we can create those conditions, the early seral conditions in good forage and the wildflowers for our pollinators and that kind of thing. How do we create and maintain them over time with some blend of harvesting and burning and wildfires? Wildfires are creating a lot of early seral condition right now, but typically in very large blocks where prehistorically, it was in much smaller blocks.
Mr. Lamster, you have a question.
Yes, I do. I've been listening, and what I'm hearing basically, unless it's a standing tree that's valuable for lumber, it has no value once it hits the ground. Everything on the ground is worthless. I always thought hiking through the woods, I've been hiking through the woods for years, that there's a lot of moisture retention in dead things on the ground, and that helps green things grow. And I'm a little disappointed in that. Everything on the ground is not just fuel. And the question is there value besides just getting rid of it so that it no longer is on the ground dead?
Yeah, and that I'll take the fall for that in the speed of going through things of giving that impression that it's the trees are only fuel or the logs are only fuel. As a matter of fact, I often try to remind people that the forest is amazing in all the things, and even beyond the trees, the forest is amazing in all the things it does for us, including like 80% of our clean water in that kind of stuff. And so I have colleagues that rightfully make the point that the second half of the life of the tree is after it falls. I appreciate those people and work with those people, as they track it from a habitat perspective, a plant diversity perspective, nurse logs for Western hemlock, all of those kinds of things. So, it definitely is an ecosystem out there. My point would be, though, that it is all fuel, living and dead. We have to remember that it is all fuel. It is all these things. It is all these things at once. And right now, a whole lot of it is burning. We're attempting to preserve a lot of standing trees that burn. We're attempting to preserve a lot of spotted owl habitat that burns. We're attempting to preserve a lot of watersheds and municipal water supplies that burn. We're particularly, we're trying to save a bunch of large logs for fishers and martins that burns. So we've got to keep it all in perspective and the reality that it is all going to burn sooner or later.
They also decay.
And they decay. And burning is rapid decomposition.
You brought back memories of me as a very young Forest Service employee, given my first drip torch and trying to consume some fuels, starting a fire. And the folks laughing at me as I use a drip torch to try to start a log on fire. It
Not
won't
gonna
work.
happen.
You've got to have ladder fuels.
Yeah.
And I think getting rid of those ladders is the key answer. But enough of my pontificating. Norm, you have
No,
another-
it's good because it raises the point, given the value of large coarse logs, that's really why our ancestors did a lot of burning in the spring as soon as they could, because the logs were pretty wet, but the fine surface fuels that would carry the prescribed fire had dried out enough to carry the fire and leave the logs behind because they knew the value of the logs.
And Native Americans too, I suspect. Dick, did you want to do
Oh,
a
I
quick
did one more
follow-up?
thing. I also, physics and chemistry came up. I guess, John, that's what you pre. How about biology?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Ecology, hydrology.
Is that being used?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Norm,
So for a small woodland owner who might want to burn, there are some severe issues with that. Could both of you address how you might approach that?
Sure, I'll start with a plug for the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council that's working on all of these things that impede our use. So we have to look at smoke management laws. We've recently made some progress with that. We need a certified workforce and trained workforce out there to do this work because as an individual landowner, you'll need help implementing a prescribed fire on your land. And now I'm drawing a blank, Amanda, on the third. Liability.
Yeah, and I'll just mention, I'll jump in here. Thanks, John. I'm actually currently on a rule advisory committee. Part of that big Senate bill was also to develop a voluntary certified burn manager program. So we are in the process of developing that program that would provide training and certification for anyone that would want to be doing burning. The primary goal is for small woodland owners to gain access to that. And there's another discussion happening that I'm not specifically in because capacity issues, but that is specifically talking about liability and what is the right liability coverage to have in conjunction with this certified burn manager program. Again, it wouldn't be a required program, but if you wanted that additional liability coverage, you could undergo this certified burn manager program to get it. So it's not in the work. I mean, it's in the works, getting developed right now because it's been shown to be a need to get more done.
thank you. Ms. Blayton, do you have a question? You're still muted, Mary. There you go.
Well, actually, what you just said brought up another point. Representative Wilde has proposed that we expand the voluntary workforce. So like, we have Peace Corps volunteers to send somewhere else, and we have AmeriCorps volunteers. And he proposed that we develop AmeriCorps volunteer programs that were specifically trained in the skills needed to work on wildfires. And it seemed like getting the certification to do prescribed burns would be one of the choices. Are there tasks that might be done so that the point he was trying to make was that community service tends to bond us in useful ways across political boundaries and give us more experience of what's happening in our world in a sense of belonging to a group. What do you think about the idea of having a kind of a conservation corps or an AmeriCorps, a volunteer service that helps with this?
I really like that idea. And I go back, back in high school, I was in the Youth Conservation Corps and certainly would be capable at least of the kind of basic fuels treatments. And assuming there were some certified people around, we could have put on our protective clothing and participated in prescribed burning as well. I think it's a wonderful program, a wonderful idea.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, Mary, that same bill, that big omnibus bill, like I said, it funded a lot of things, not to the level we need, but it funded a lot of things. And one of those is an Oregon Conservation Corps. So the intention is to bring in young adults. I want to say 18 to 24, maybe younger than that. I can't remember exactly the age range, so don't quote me on that. But that is being developed, and so the Higher Education Coordinating Committee, also known as HEC, is in charge of managing those, the other conservation corps in the state, and so they are also going to be in charge of developing and managing the Oregon Conservation Corps with a governor-appointed committee that will oversee that development. And so as Associated Oregon Loggers, we obviously, our members do some of that work. And so we're going to be engaged in that process. We have a brand new workforce development program. So the intention is not just to produce more loggers, but to produce more forest contractors of all kinds. And there's a large need to have more folks in the workforce that can do prescribed fire, fuel breaks, road clearing, all of that. So thinning, everything under the sun. We can throw all the money we want at the problem, but if we don't have the workforce and the capacity to get it done, we're never going to achieve our goals. So that was one piece in there. Hopefully, those folks that come through that program want to become foresters, want to become operators, and we can give them pathways for their success.
Well, I would just throw in a couple of things that I hope are encouraging. One is work a little bit with EWEB, and I know they have changed their policies about shutting down their systems when they are concerned that high winds are coming. And hopefully that'll be a way that we can avoid at least that ignition source. And my hope is that people get a little more tolerant to a little bit of prescribed burn smoke as well. Yeah. It's often been the case that people raise heck because there's smoke in the air when it's being done as a part of prescribed fire. So I will end my pontificating there and thank both Mr. Bailey and Ms. Astor for joining us today and all these great questions that our guest questioners provided as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Great program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This has been our October 22nd, 2021 program. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support also comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, U of O has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information can be found at uoregon.edu. And Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. And finally, Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality education opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. I would also like to acknowledge our Ruby sponsor, Johnson, Lucas & Middleton. Support for the City Club comes from Johnson, Lucas & Middleton, a team of experienced, compassionate attorneys fighting for justice. If you have been seriously harmed by wrongdoing and need help, contact them at justicelawyers.com. And our gold sponsors, AARP of Oregon and Jerry Diethelm, architect, landscape architect. Before we thank our speakers today, I have a few quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you, as always, to public radio station KLCC FM 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7. Our programs are always available on your YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. If you are a City Club member, you can ask a question at a future taping of our programs. We'd like you to do that. If you are not yet a member, you can join and then participate. Consider yourself invited. More information is on our website, cityclubofeugene.org. In our next program, as Eugene prepares to welcome the world for the 2022 World Athletics Championships, an event that's traditionally held in cities such as Moscow and Beijing and London and Doha, City Club welcomes an expert panel to discuss what track and field means to our city and region, and how every member of our community can be part of this extraordinary opportunity. Tracktown meets the world, what Oregon 22 can mean for Eugene. So please join us again on October 29th. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website. Now I want to thank our speakers for a great program. Amanda Astor and John Bailey, thank you very much. This concludes today's program. Hope you all have a good week. Thank you.